The morning I found my late wife's reading chair sitting out at the curb for garbage pickup, rain already soaking into the cushion. My daughter-in-law was inside painting over her side of our closet. She didn't even turn around when I asked what was happening. She just told me the deed to my house already had her name on it. I stood in my own driveway, holding a paper bag of blood pressure medication, staring at 40 years of my marriage getting rained on next to a trash can, and I asked her one question. "Whose name is on the freight company, Priscilla?" She laughed. She had no idea what that question actually meant. Neither did my son. Neither, if I'm honest, did I fully understand 7 months earlier, standing at Marion's grave, exactly how much that one sentence was about to cost my family everything they thought they already owned. Welcome to Family Story Archives. Get comfortable. This one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My name is Bennett Cole. I'm 70 years old. I live at 214 Magnolia Bend Road in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a single-story brick house Marion and I bought in 1987 for $18,000, back when that street was still half gravel and the nearest streetlight was 2 blocks down. I re-shingled the carport myself last October, before the arthritis in my shoulder made ladders a bad idea. My one real hobby is restoring old CB radios, 14 of them in the garage, most bought for a few dollars at estate sales, all of them working again by the time I'm done. If you asked me what I did for a living, I'd tell you I drove trucks most of my life. Nothing special about that. It's not exactly a lie. It's just not the whole manifest. What almost nobody in my family knew, including my own son, was that I still held 51% of Cole Freight Lines through a trust my lawyer set up in 2003, the year I handed the president title to Tyler and stepped back. Tyler's name is on the letterhead, the trucks, the building sign on Choctaw Drive. But the real paperwork, the kind that decides who owns what when things go sideways, has always said Bennett Cole, in trust, 51%. Marion knew. My lawyer, Diane Marsh, knew. Nobody else did. Marion used to say that was the one secret in our marriage she was glad to keep, after watching 2 of her own cousins go a decade without speaking over a boat and a strip of lakefront land their father left behind without a clear plan. "Let Tyler build something he's proud of," she told me once. "Tell him the rest when it actually matters." I figured that day would come when I was old and slowing down, on my own terms. I didn't picture it happening in a title company conference room because my own son's wife forced the timing. That's the kind of thing you carry alone, and I carried it for 21 years without a single problem, until my wife got sick. Marion was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in September of 2024. She died on December 3rd, 7 months before the morning her chair ended up at the curb in the rain. I remember the funeral more in pieces than as a whole day, the way grief tends to work on a person. I remember Tyler's hand on my shoulder at the graveside, heavier than I expected from a grown man. I remember Louise standing 2 rows back, not crowding me, just present. The way she'd been present for 36 years of Marion's life and now, apparently, mine. I remember Priscilla bringing a casserole to the house that same evening, and how normal that felt at the time. How I had no reason yet to wonder about anything except how I was going to fill the rest of my own life without the woman who'd filled 42 years of it already. Tyler and Priscilla started coming around more after that, which I appreciated, or thought I did, until I understood it wasn't me they were circling. The first slight was small enough that I told myself I was imagining it. January 14th, a Sunday. Priscilla stood in my kitchen doorway, looked at the calendar still hanging on the wall with Marion's handwriting on it, doctor's appointments crossed out in blue pen, and said, "You should really update this, Bennett. It's been 2 months." Careless, not cruel. The kind of thing you let go. There was a smaller moment before that one, actually. One I didn't think much of at the time, but replay differently now. New Year's Day, Priscilla walked through the house with a tape measure and a small notebook, telling me she was just getting a feel for the space, in case they ever needed to help me downsize things as I got older. She measured the hallway, the bedroom door frames, the width of the driveway. I thought it was strange, mildly, the way you notice a stranger standing too close to you in a checkout line, and then forget about it within the hour. I didn't forget about it for long, as it turned out. There was Tyler's birthday, too, the last week of January, a small dinner at their house that Priscilla had planned herself. I noticed halfway through that every seat at the table had a place card except mine, and I ended up pulling a folding chair in from the garage while everyone else waited on me to sit down before starting the meal. Nobody apologized for the oversight. Priscilla called it an accident, said she must have miscounted, and maybe she had. But I drove home that night turning over Marion's old rule in my head, the one she used to say about seating charts at church potlucks. You can always tell who a family still counts as family by whether there's a chair already waiting for them before they walk in the room. I should tell you, too, that most of that January, I still called Marion's old cell number some evenings, just to hear her voicemail greeting, 4 words and a laugh at the end of them that I'd heard 1,000 times, and somehow still wasn't ready to lose. Priscilla found out about that habit sometime in February. I never figured out how, and mentioned once, almost gently, that maybe it was time I let the account lapse, since keeping it active was just money for nothing. I let that one go too, the same as everything else, though I never did cancel the account, and I still call it some nights, sitting in the dark, holding the phone up to my ear like a much younger man. The second one cut deeper, though I didn't understand why until much later. Early February, a Wednesday, I went looking for Marion's sewing machine, the singer she'd had since before we were married, wanting to fix the bobbin case for no reason, except that touching her things still felt like something close to having her back for a minute. That machine had sat in the same corner of the hall closet since 1983. I could still picture her at it on Saturday mornings, coffee going cold on the side table, humming along to whatever was on the radio while she hemmed something for one of Tyler's school events. It wasn't in the closet. Priscilla told me she'd had it hauled to a donation center in January, said it was just collecting dust, and she figured I'd never use it anyway. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood in that closet a long moment, looking at the empty space where 40 years of Saturday mornings used to sit, running my hand along the shelf like the machine might still be there if I looked hard enough. And I understood, without being able to prove a single thing yet, that this wasn't about dust. The third time, Priscilla told me she'd canceled my shell card, the one the company had always covered since I still consulted on routing 2 days a week. "We're tightening things up," she said. "It's not personal, it's just numbers." I told Tyler about it that same week, expecting him to fix it without much fuss. Instead, he sighed, rubbed the back of his neck the way he'd done since he was a teenager avoiding an argument, and told me Priscilla had a lot on her plate right now, that she was just trying to help the family save money, and maybe I could ease up on reading into everything she did. I stood there a moment, waiting for him to ask me a single follow-up question, whether I was managing all right without that card, whether the timing bothered me given everything else that had happened since December. He didn't ask. He just went back to his phone. Hearing my own son defend the woman who'd sold his mother's sewing machine without asking anybody hurt worse than the canceled card ever could. And it was the first time I understood, really understood, that if this got worse, I wasn't going to be able to count on Tyler noticing until it was almost too late. By early March, I let a folder about assisted living on Jefferson Highway sit on my workbench for 2 weeks without saying a word, because some part of me was still hoping Tyler would notice on his own, without me having to point at it. He didn't. Not until the morning I've already told you about. The morning of the chair. "Mom needs somewhere quiet," Priscilla said, before I'd even gotten out of the truck that morning. "The room's just sitting empty, Bennett. It's not doing Marion any good anymore." Sandra stood by the porch steps with 2 suitcases, not saying a word, just watching, the way you watch a fight you already suspect you shouldn't be part of. I asked who had signed off on this. "Tyler," she said, that morning, over the phone while I was out. I asked whose name was really on the house deed, mostly to see what she'd say. "It's in my name now, actually," Priscilla told me. "Tyler added me back in January for tax reasons. You signed paperwork about it yourself, at the kitchen table, before Christmas." I did remember signing something. 3 pages Tyler brought over 11 days after Marion's funeral. Something he called an insurance update. I hadn't read every line. My wife had been dead 11 days. I was not, at that particular moment, a man reading fine print carefully. "That's not what I signed," I told her. "It's exactly what you signed," she said. "Diane Marsh notarized it. Call her yourself if you don't believe me." That was the first time Diane's name got used against me instead of for me, and it landed somewhere I felt in my back teeth. If my own lawyer of 34 years had really put her stamp on a page that gave away my house, one of 2 things was true, and I intended to know which before the sun went down. I stood there another moment, looking past Priscilla into the house, at Sandra's suitcases now sitting just inside the front door, at the bare corner by the living room window where Marion's chair should have been, and something in me went very still and very quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't calm so much as a person deciding, deliberately, not to say the next 4 or 5 things sitting on his tongue. "I'll be back," I told Priscilla, and I got in my truck and drove straight to Diane Marsh's office on North Boulevard without calling ahead. But something else was pulling at me harder than the deed. If Tyler had signed away the house on paperwork he never read, what did that tell me about whether he understood anything he actually owned, including 41 trucks and a warehouse he'd run for 23 years without once asking whose name was really on it? If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I called Diane Marsh that same night. There was no deed transfer in her files, she confirmed. Nothing with my real signature on it. Only the insurance amendment she'd actually notarized in December. So either Priscilla was lying, or somebody had gotten a deed notarized by someone else and hoped I'd never check. She pulled the parish land records the next morning with a paralegal's help. The house was still mine, sole owner, exactly as it had been since 1987. Whatever Priscilla believed she had, the courthouse had never heard of it, which told Diane one thing right away. People don't announce ownership of something they don't have unless they're about to make it true, she said. Watch the calendar, Bennett. Somebody's going to try to make this official, and fast. I sat with that on the phone a long moment, looking down the hallway at Sandra's closed door, and asked Diane the second question that had been sitting under my ribs since the driveway. Does Tyler know about the trust? No, she said. You told me in 2003 you didn't want him to know until he needed to. Has something changed? I looked at that closed door again. Something's about to, I told her. Tyler mentioned, almost in passing over dinner in late March, that Priscilla had been helping him organize property paperwork for the warehouse, and that the company was thinking about selling the undeveloped 2 acres behind the Choctaw Drive building to an investor named Curtis Rainey, a client of hers from the dental office where she kept books. I asked whose signature would be on that sale. Tyler's, he said, since he was president. I asked whose name was actually on the deed to that land. He didn't know. 23 years running that company, and my son had never once pulled the property records on the building he worked out of. I didn't say much else to him that night. I just went home and called Diane first thing the next morning. Diane's paralegal, a young woman named Odalis who'd worked with her almost 5 years, called me back within a day, before Diane herself even had a chance to. She'd found the February filing almost by accident, cross-referencing notary logs across 3 parishes out of habit, something Diane had trained her to do on every case involving a family trust after getting burned once, years earlier, by a filing nobody thought to double-check. I almost skipped that log, Odalis told me. It's the kind of paperwork most people never look at twice. I've thought about that more than once since. How close the whole truth came to sitting quietly in a filing cabinet forever, if one young woman hadn't been thorough out of habit rather than suspicion. Diane found the answer within days. A quitclaim deed had been filed on February 9th, moving that 2-acre parcel out of the family trust and into Cole Freight Lines, LLC, under a notarized signature that was supposed to be mine. I had never signed it. I had never met the notary who stamped it. A quick visit to his UPS store office off Airline Highway confirmed what I already suspected. A well-dressed woman had brought in a folder already filled out in February, told him her father-in-law had a bad hip and couldn't make the appointment, and walked out with a stamp on a signature she'd clearly practiced more than once. He hadn't checked her power of attorney closely, he admitted, just confirmed a folder existed with something official-looking inside it. I didn't blame him entirely, though Diane later said his notary bond insurance was going to have an uncomfortable spring because of it. I sat in Diane's office the following Monday while she laid the whole picture out for me across her desk, and somewhere in the middle of it, without meaning to, I found myself telling her about the sewing machine instead of the deed. She let me talk. She'd known Marion almost as long as I had drafted her will, had sat across this same desk from both of us more times than either of us could count over 3 decades. "This isn't really about a warehouse parcel anymore, is it?" she said. Not really a question. I told her it hadn't been about the parcel since the day I found that closet empty. She nodded, closed the folder for a moment, and told me something I've held on to since. The law can get you your land back, Bennett. It can't get you your wife's sewing machine back, not the actual one. You already know that. Just make sure whatever you decide to do next Thursday, you're doing it for the right one of those 2 reasons. 2 weeks passed, and on the surface, things went almost quiet. Then Sandra had her first real crack. It was late March, maybe 10 days after she'd moved in, and I found her standing in the kitchen doorway one morning holding one of Marion's old serving bowls, the one with the chip on the rim, like she didn't know whether she was allowed to use it. "Priscilla told me this was just extra stuff," she said. "I didn't realize it was your wife's good china." She put it back in the cabinet without another word, and over the following days I noticed she stopped touching anything in that kitchen that had clearly belonged to Marion, not because anyone told her to, but because something in her had started to feel the weight of what her daughter was doing. A week later, she left a note on my counter, unsigned, that just said, "I'm sorry about the chair." I never mentioned it to her. She never mentioned it to me. But I kept that note in my truck's glove box through the whole rest of the spring, because it was the first sign anybody in that house besides me thought something here had gone wrong. I leaned on Louise Fontenot more than I probably should have that month, and she never once made me feel like a burden for it. She'd known Marion since 1988, back when Louise's own husband was still alive, and the four of us used to grill on Sunday afternoons until dark. She'd sat through 3 rounds of chemo in that same kitchen, and she'd shown up the day after the funeral with a casserole and a very clear statement that she wasn't going anywhere, deed or no deed, family or no family. When I told her about the bedroom, the sewing machine, the ring, she didn't offer me a single comforting word. She just grabbed her purse and said, "We're going to the clerk of court. Right now. I'm driving." I told her on the way over that some part of me was ashamed it had taken this long to notice what was happening under my own roof. "Marion would have caught it faster," Louise said. "But slow isn't the same as blind, Bennett. You're seeing it now. That's what matters." That same week gave me the mini heartstopper of the whole ordeal. Going through the box of Marion's things Priscilla had moved to the garage, still slightly damp from a leak nobody had mentioned to me, I found her jewelry case and her wedding ring wasn't in it. I sat on an overturned bucket in that garage for a long time. The same garage where I fixed the radios, holding an empty velvet case that should have had 39 years of marriage sitting inside it. Sandra told me quietly, almost apologetically, that Priscilla had taken it to a jeweler on Florida Boulevard back in February, just to get it appraised, though nobody had ever asked her to. I got it back 2 days later, no explanation given, no argument started, but something about holding that ring again, cold in my palm, made the rest of what I was learning feel less like a legal problem and more like a slow theft of every physical piece of my wife I had left. The closing on the 2-acre parcel was set for April 17th, 3 weeks out. I could have gone to the police right then. Instead, I wanted my son to see, with his own eyes, exactly what his wife had done, and exactly what she still didn't understand she'd been standing next to the whole time. Diane filed the forgery complaint quietly on April 4th, under an active investigation exception that kept it out of public notice for 2 weeks, giving me the window I needed. I nearly blew that window myself on April 6th, running into Priscilla outside the clerk of court's office. She asked, too casually, what I was doing there. I told her I was checking Marion's estate paperwork, which wasn't entirely a lie. She studied my face a beat too long before Tyler called about dinner and the moment passed. I sat in my truck 10 minutes afterward before I trusted myself to drive. 2 days after that, cleaning out the garage to make room for a radio I'd just bought at an estate sale, I found a spiral notebook wedged behind an old paint can, the kind of hiding spot you'd only notice if you were looking. It was Priscilla's. Inside were pages of numbers, property values for the 2-acre parcel pulled from 3 different real estate sites, a rough timeline with dates circled, February notary, March move-in, April closing, and one line, near the bottom of a page dated back in January, that read simply, "If B finds out before closing, deny everything. T won't believe him over me." Reading my own son's name reduced to an initial in his wife's handwriting, treated like a variable in a plan rather than a person, told me more about where things actually stood than any land record Diane pulled that whole month. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it and told Diane about it that same afternoon. She told me not to touch it again, that it might matter later, and it did, though not in the way either of us expected, since Priscilla never once asked where it had gone. The night before the closing, I barely slept. I sat at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning with Diane's folder in front of me, and for the first time since March, I actually considered calling the whole plan off. Not because Priscilla deserved mercy I hadn't already decided to give her, but because some part of me was afraid of what watching this happen in front of Tyler was going to do to my son, regardless of who was in the right. I kept thinking about him at 19, riding shotgun with me on runs to Shreveport, asleep against the window by mile marker 60 every single time, no matter how loud I turned the radio up trying to keep us both awake. I'd built that company partly so he'd never have to worry the way I'd worried at his age. Watching him find out, in one afternoon, that the ground under all of it had never been fully his felt like undoing something I'd spent 20 years trying to give him. Louise called around 6:30, just to ask if I wanted company. "You'll do the right thing," she said, "whatever that turns out to look like today." I wasn't sure I believed her yet. I got in the truck anyway. April 17th, 71 degrees, clear sky, the kind of afternoon Marion used to call porch weather. The closing was set for 2 o'clock at Rainey's Title Company on Perkins Road. Diane rode with me, a thick folder on her lap. We watched Curtis Rainey's Lexus pull in, then Tyler's truck 4 minutes later, Priscilla beside him wearing a smile I hadn't seen on her since her wedding day. We gave them 11 minutes, pens already uncapped, before we walked in, because Diane wanted the signatures already in motion before anything got said, so nobody in that room could later claim they hadn't fully meant to sign. "Afternoon," I said. Priscilla's face didn't change at first. For half a second, she looked almost pleased to see me, the way you'd greet a relative who'd wandered into the wrong meeting by accident. Then she saw Diane's folder, thick enough to need a rubber band around it, and something in her started to slip. Rainey looked between the four of us, pen still in hand, clearly trying to decide whether this was a family surprise or something that was about to cost him money. Tyler hadn't looked up from the contract yet, still signing the second page, his pen moving in that unhurried way of a man who has no idea the ground under him is about to shift. "Bennett," she said, recovering fast, "this doesn't concern you. This is a company matter." "It is," I said. "That's exactly why I'm here." Diane laid out just enough. The trust from 2003, 51% still mine, the forged February signature on the 2-acre parcel. Rainey's face shifted the second the word fraud entered the room. But I wasn't looking at Rainey. I was looking at my son. "Dad," Tyler said, voice low, "is this real? You own the company?" 51%, I said. "I always have. I wanted you to run something you'd earned the feel of, not something you were just waiting to inherit. That was my choice, and maybe the wrong one because it left a gap, and your wife found it before you ever did. You let me run this place 20 years thinking it was mine," Tyler said, and there was more hurt in it than anger, which landed harder than anything Priscilla had said all afternoon. "And she forged your signature because she figured out it wasn't." "Both true," I said. "I kept a secret from you for 2 decades. That's on me. What she did with the gap I left, that's on her." "You forged his signature," Tyler said, turning to Priscilla now, and his voice actually cracked on the word forged, the first real crack I'd heard in him since Marion's funeral. "You sold my mother's sewing machine without asking anybody. You had her wedding ring appraised behind my back. And now this. 6 weeks you've known, and you let me sign a contract this morning." I did this for us, Priscilla said, quieter now, mostly to him. So we'd finally have something that was really ours, not something we were always just borrowing from him. She looked around the room, at Rainey already backing toward the door, at Diane's folder still open on the table, like she was searching for one more person who might still see it her way. You don't understand what it's like, she said, to nobody in particular now. Watching everything always sit in somebody else's name. My father lost his whole store that way. I wasn't going to let that happen to us too. Borrowing, Tyler repeated, and he almost laughed, though nothing about it was funny. You think I've been borrowing my own father's trust in me my whole life? He handed me a company, Priscilla. He let me build a career on his name and never once held it over me. And instead of asking either of us a single honest question, you forged a signature and put my name on a deal that could have put us both in a courtroom. He turned to me then, and for a second, the anger dropped out of his face entirely, leaving something closer to a child asking a question he was afraid of the answer to. Why didn't you just tell me, Dad? 20 years. Why did I have to find out like this? Because I kept waiting for a moment that felt right, I said. And there's never a moment that feels right to hand your son the one thing you built your whole life around. I should have told you anyway. That's mine to carry, not an excuse for what she did, but it's mine. Something passed between us in that second. Not forgiveness yet. Just the two of us finally standing in the same truth at the same time, maybe for the first time in years. You could have told me any of it, Tyler said to Priscilla, quieter now. Any single piece of it. Instead, I found out standing in a title office, watching my father's lawyer read your fraud out loud in front of a stranger, writing a $400,000 check. He looked at me, then back at her, and something in his face finally settled into a decision he hadn't wanted to make. I need you to leave. Not the room, the house, tonight. Rainey was already gathering his copies, done with the whole deal the second fraud entered the sentence. At the door, he looked back at Priscilla, not unkindly. You should have had someone check the actual title before you brought me this, he said, and left without shaking anyone's hand. I didn't say much more in that room myself. Officer Delacroix was waiting outside, not to make an arrest that afternoon, just to take Diane's complaint through the process the parish clerk had already quietly started. Out in the parking lot afterward, Tyler found me before I made it to my truck. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking about as young as I'd seen him look in years. I don't know what to do with all of this yet, he finally said. The company, her, any of it. I told him he didn't have to know tonight. I told him the only thing that actually needed deciding tonight was where he was going to sleep, and that my guest room still had clean sheets on it if he wanted them. He took me up on it. Priscilla packed a single suitcase that same night, standing in what used to be Marion's bedroom for the last time, Sandra helping her fold clothes in a silence neither of them tried to fill with anything. I stood in the hallway for a moment, not to gloat. I want to be clear about that, but because some part of me needed to see it end the way it had started, in that same doorway. She didn't look at me on her way out. Tyler carried her suitcase to the car himself, which surprised me, and said something to her at the curb I didn't try to hear. Whatever it wasn't shouting. He came back inside afterward and didn't say a word about it, and I didn't ask. Sandra stayed another hour, packing her own things more slowly, and before she left, she stopped in the kitchen doorway, the same spot where I'd found her holding Marion's chipped serving bowl weeks earlier. I should have said something sooner, she told me. I saw pieces of it. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told her I understood exactly what that felt like, since I'd told myself the same thing about my own son for months longer than I should have. She hugged me before she left, which neither of us expected, and said she hoped I'd let her call sometimes, just to check in. I told her she could. She asked quietly, standing at the door with her bag over one shoulder, whether I thought Priscilla had ever really loved Tyler, or whether all of it, the marriage included, had somehow been about the same thing the deed was about. I told her I didn't think those two things were as separate as she was hoping I'd say they were, and that some people build a whole life trying to make sure the ground never shifts under them again, even when it costs them the one thing that would have kept the ground steady in the first place, which was just being honest with the people standing on it beside them. We didn't talk much more than that the rest of the evening. Tyler and I just sat on the porch a while, the two of us, in a quiet that felt different from the one I'd been living in alone since December. What happened to Priscilla legally in the weeks after isn't really the story I want to tell you. What mattered happened afterward, at home, on Magnolia Bend Road, between a father and a son who had a lot of years of silence to start undoing. Priscilla pled to forgery and attempted fraudulent transfer in late June, restitution and probation, no prison time, and a record that closed the door on ever handling anyone else's books again. Sandra moved back to her own apartment on Florida Boulevard in early May, and called twice afterward just to say she was sorry, which I hadn't expected and didn't ask for, but took anyway. The second call, she told me she'd kept that unsigned note she left on my counter a copy of, in her own handwriting, because she wanted to remember what it felt like the first time she realized her daughter had crossed a line that couldn't be walked back easily. Tyler and Priscilla separated for 11 weeks. They're still married now, still working through it every other Wednesday in a counselor's office, and where that ends up isn't mine to have an opinion about. Tyler went the first 2 sessions alone, before Priscilla agreed to come at all, and he told me once, driving back from the warehouse together in June, that those 2 sessions were the first time in years he'd said out loud, to anyone, that he'd felt like a guest in his own marriage and his own company at the same time, without fully understanding why until that afternoon in the title office made it plain. What I do know is that Tyler comes by most Saturdays now, not because anyone makes him. In June, he spent a whole weekend re-shingling the carport with me, even though I'd already fixed it myself back in October. He didn't say much while we worked. Neither did I. Somewhere around the 3rd Saturday, he finally asked what else I hadn't told him. I told him the truth. Nothing. The trust was the one thing, and now that it was out in the open, there was nothing left in any drawer that could surprise him. He needed to hear that more than once, so I've said it as many times as it takes. He calls me now before decisions that used to just get made without me. Small things mostly. A routing software. A driver he's considering for dispatch. I don't tell him what to do, I just listen. The way I should have been letting him talk things through with me all along, instead of quietly holding the one card that mattered and hoping he'd never need to see it. One Saturday in late June, sitting on the porch after we'd finished the carport, Tyler asked me something that stuck with me longer than almost anything else said that whole spring. He asked if I'd ever considered, even once, just giving him the 51% outright years ago instead of waiting. I told him the honest answer, which is that I'd thought about it more times than I could count, usually late at night, usually not long after Marion first got sick, when I started to understand my own time on this earth wasn't unlimited either. I just never found the right afternoon to hand it over. There's no ceremony for a moment like that. You just have to pick a day and mean it. I told him I meant to pick one eventually. I told him I hadn't expected to run out of time to choose it on my own terms. He asked me, too, whether I regretted keeping it secret for so long, and I gave that question longer than the last one, because it deserved it. I told him I regretted the shape the secret ended up taking, the way it gave somebody else a gap to climb through before he ever got the chance to grow into it honestly. But I told him I didn't regret wanting him to run something on his own instincts, without my thumb on it, even quietly. That part I'd do the same way again, I said, if I had it to do over. Just the timing I'd change, just the day I finally sat him down. He didn't say anything for a while after that. We just sat there, the two of us, watching the last of the light go off the carport roof we'd just finished, and it was enough that evening to sit in that particular kind of quiet, without needing either of us to fill it. Diane sent me a bill in April for 11 hours of work, she admitted. Later, she'd undercharged me for on purpose. I told her 34 years bought a man a discount every now and then. She told me the discount was for Marion, not for me. Officer Delacroix stopped by once in late May, off duty, just checking in the way he'd done for Louise since her break-in 2 years back. He told me the hardest calls in 20 years on the job were never the loud ones. The quiet ones stuck with him longer, he said. The ones where nobody raised their voice and somebody still lost almost everything. I think about that most Sundays now, sitting on the porch with Louise's coffee going cold beside me, watching Tyler's truck pull in the driveway like it belongs there again, because it does. Neighbors up and down Magnolia Bend Road noticed too, the way small streets always notice things eventually. A few of them told Louise, who told me, that they'd wondered for months why Tyler's truck had stopped showing up on weekends the way it always used to, back when Marion was still alive to fill the driveway with the smell of something cooking every Saturday afternoon. It's back now. That's the part that matters to me most, more than any deed or any signature ever could. Louise still comes by on Sundays with more coffee than either of us needs, and I've never once let her forget she was the one who drove me to the courthouse the day this whole thing turned from a bad feeling into a fact. I bought Marion's sewing machine back from that donation center in May, not the original. That one was long gone by then, but the same model, and I keep it in the hall closet where hers used to sit, bobbin case fixed, though nobody in this house sews a stitch anymore. Some mornings I open that closet door just to look at it sitting there, and I couldn't tell you exactly what I'm checking for. Maybe just that it's still there. Maybe just that some things, once you put them back, are allowed to stay put. I still call Marion's old number some nights, sitting on the porch after Louise has gone home, holding the phone up to my ear the same way I did all through January and February, before any of this started, before I understood that grief and vigilance were going to end up living in the same house together for a while. Her voicemail greeting hasn't changed. 4 words and a laugh at the end of them. I don't imagine I'll ever let that account lapse, whatever it costs me, because some debts aren't really about money, and I learned that lesson twice this past year. Once from a woman who was gone, and once from one who tried to make sure I'd lose everything Marion and I had built before I even had the chance to grieve her properly. Her chair came back inside the same week I found it at the curb, dried out on the porch for 2 days first, cushion restuffed by an upholstery shop on Florida Boulevard that did it for half price once I explained why it mattered. It sits in the corner by the window again, right where it always did, and some mornings I still expect to walk in and find it missing, until I remember I'm the one who carried it back myself, out of the rain, on my own 2 feet, the same morning I first understood what was actually happening under my roof. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry out of this, it's simple enough to fit on the back of a business card. Whatever you think you already own outright, in your family, your marriage, your own name, check the manifest before you sign for anything, and check it twice before you let somebody else sign for you. Paperwork doesn't lie the way people sometimes do. It just waits, patiently, for somebody to actually read it. I learned that lesson the hard way. The same spring I carried my wife's chair in from the rain and set it back down exactly where it belonged. In the one corner of this house nobody gets to move again without asking me first. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Family Story Archives. I will see you on the next one.